Thank you all for coming. I am a veterinarian, but this talk is geared towards people thinking about pursuing a career in veterinary medicine. But really, this is for anyone who would like to understand why good people do bad things and what to do about it. So, you may have seen this story about Miami Seaquarium in the news, and this story really highlights the psychological challenges veterinarians and staff face that cause good animal-loving people to betray their conscience and do things that harm animals. Several former employees reached out to us to discuss their concerns about what was happening at Miami Seaquarium. The Miami Seaquarium has a long history of being under scrutiny. In fact, one of our honors veterinarians has been advocating against Miami Seaquarium, trying to save Lolita, the orca, also known as Tokite or Toki, from a small tank where she was confined for more than 50 years until her recent death. After the dolphin company purchased the facility and Toki was scheduled to be moved and potentially transitioned to a sea pen for possible release, though she had been sick for many years, so that probably wasn't likely, we all hoped that things at Miami Seaquarium would improve. The dolphin company promised to make investments in the facility, seek AZA accreditation. Instead, immediately upon taking over the facility, the corporate managers cut the food of the animals, told staff not to discuss their concerns about the fish or the feed cuts with veterinary staff. Why did they do this? Well, they cut the food to get the animals to perform better. And these are outdated, antiquated training methods, but had been this company's practice at all of their facilities. And everyone believed that they knew what they were doing, but marine mammals depend on fish to maintain their hydration. And these rapid and drastic cuts led many of them to become dehydrated. And the corporate managers also demanded increased interactions with the public, which caused many to become agitated, behaving aggressively towards their customers and towards the trainers. And the USDA came in and saw the malnourishment and the crumbling facility and cited them. But instead of the dolphin company reprimanding those in management who had failed, they rewarded those who stayed loyal to the company and sought to protect their image while retaliating against those who voiced concerns and worked with the USDA. Firing them or making things just so uncomfortable for them that these good employees ultimately left. And now inexperienced staff were hired who didn't know any better and trusted the judgment of these experienced corporate managers. And trainers and animal care staff make very little money. They do it for the love of the animals. And meanwhile, the CEO, Eduardo Albor, is a very wealthy man. He lives in a multi-million-dollar penthouse in Miami with reportedly having over 20 cars. And this pattern continued for years. And you might ask, why would people continue working for this company? They loved animals and they kept thinking that things would get better. Their friends worked there, they were socially connected to the place, and they believed in the leader, Eduardo, who was a very charismatic person and very hopeful and inspiring. And those who voiced concerns faced bullying and retaliation. They all signed non-disclosure agreements for their job, to accept their job. So they couldn't speak to the media, but I can. And now their veterinarian has resigned. And the dolphin company just posted that they were looking for a relief veterinarian for their marine land facility in St. Augustine, presumably so that the marine land vet can come down and work for Miami Seaquarium. And we responded warning veterinarians not to take this job and further enable the Seaquarium to stay open. That post was taken down, and then ultimately, after I posted the recent Intercept article, that comment was also taken down. And many people were excited about working for marine land, excited to work for dolphins. They said, no experience needed, we'll help you, we can mentor you. Of course, they want to bring in people who don't know any better. And this company is also suing an activist for publishing drone footage. And it was just released through court documents that they invested in a drone alert system that sends emails to them with this captured drone information, like what model was used and the serial number. I wasn't even aware that these things exist, but they cost about $18,000 a year. When the Dolphin Company failed to pay for diagnostics, they failed to pay their debts to diagnostic companies and suppliers, who ultimately cut them off, and staff had to scramble to search for companies who would supply them. So I shared their story publicly so they could remain anonymous, and we went to the facilities ourselves, documented the conditions, drafted a detailed statement describing the criminal animal cruelty present in the facility, and sent that letter to the state attorney, mayor, commissioners, and police, and more than a dozen veterinarians helped draft the statement. And we are encouraging more veterinarians to sign on and post this poster at their clinic in a sign of solidarity. But this aquarium story, showing how people's love of animals becomes weaponized to ultimately protect and legitimize a company that's hoping to make profits, very much parallels my own experience growing up in 4-H and how animal-loving people can become conditioned to cause harm to animals. And I grew up in a rural farm community. My neighbors raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. And because I loved animals, I joined 4-H in hopes of learning more about animals. And I became vice president of my 4-H club. And I showed goats and horses at the county fair. And I was also an avid equestrian and trained and competed horses in dressage and 3-day eventing. And in the late 1800s, researchers discovered that adults in the farming community did not readily accept new agricultural developments that came from university campuses. So they developed 4-H, which is a government-run youth development program based out of the land-grant universities, with the goal of bringing modern ideas about technology and agriculture to local communities by connecting these communities through their more open-minded children. And in 4-H, we learned a lot about important things like responsibility for the animals you cared for, and that you had a duty to make sure that they had adequate food, shelter, water, veterinary care, and when the time came, a quick and painless death. But I also saw, even in the best settings, when animals like our 4-H animals received individual care, if the ultimate goal is profit, you can't always act in their best interests. But especially the business model of current modern industrial animal agriculture inherently betrays those basic values that we learned in 4-H. So there's no way to ensure that these large numbers of confined animals receive food, water, veterinary care, and a quick and painless death. And you might know the story of the girl who was in 4-H and had a change of heart, and she didn't want to sell her 4-H goat Cedar, who she had grown, to love, and she didn't want to sell him to slaughter. And she and the goat suffered extreme consequences for failing to go along with the system. Police were called. They went on a 500-mile hunt to seize Cedar. They took him directly to the slaughterhouse with no due process of the law. And they even got the Attorney General of California to try to sue the family. And the fair and 4-H tried to make the child out to be a villain, placing the organization's interests above compassion and respect for a child's change of heart and moral growth. And if this child was to go on to veterinary school, she would see the same mentality is repeated as I saw in the veterinary profession. In Miami Aquarium, 4-H, and veterinary school all highlight the same pattern and structures that lead us to betray our conscience and harm the most powerless members of society. And I don't know if you've all seen this video but it went viral, and suddenly people are becoming aware of how weird pig showing is. And I think it just goes to show how a group of people can be conditioned to behave in very strange ways and do very strange things that maybe started off making sense, but then it evolves into this thing that really makes no sense. And, it started off, it makes sense to keep an eye on the judge, but then in showmanship, you are awarded for these kind of over-the-top displays, which ultimately detracts from what you were originally trying to do. And I never end up raising an animal that I ended up selling at the county fair, but I did feel the social pressure to betray my conscience and attachment to the animal that I was caring for. And I understand why some people did decide to ultimately engage in selling their animal for profit. And they learned that detaching and objectifying animals was a sign of maturity. And upon, kind of reflecting now, I realize how both 4-H and the horse world manipulate people to not trust their own judgment and their own instincts, using very similar methods. And archaeologist Stephen Mithen described that we gained the ability to empathize with other species around 100,000 years ago. So empathy for animals is in our nature. This new trait gave us the advantage of cooperative communication, which ironically made us better hunters. And our ability to recognize what other animals were feeling gave us insight into the movements of our prey. And when our survival depended on it, we could be strategic killers, but killers with emotional baggage. And seeing the suffering of animals that we harm weighs on our conscience, something that I felt when I was an undergrad animal science student asked to cut off a baby sheep's tail with a hot blade with no anesthesia as part of my undergraduate animal science class at UC Davis. And this paper examines the socialization process kids go through in 4-H. The authors say the ability to avoid attachment was especially important as a milestone, signifying that these apprentices were no longer little kids. Several observed, as did one 17-year-old girl, that the little kids get more attached and more teary-eyed. And over the years, 4-Hers learned how to manage their emotions through cognitive techniques, not to stifle or control them, but to change ideas or thoughts in service of changing the feelings associated with them. One technique used to accomplish this was not naming their animals. For example, a 16-year-old boy raising pigs said, "Don't get too close to them, don't name them. You're more attached to them if you name them." And he simply clapped his hands to get their attention and referred to this one or that one. And another one said that there had simply been too many animals over the years in 4-H to come up with new names. So I don't bother with names, he said of his steers. And Bradley Miller says that teaching a child not to step on a caterpillar is as valuable to the child as it is to the caterpillar. So something to think about as we progress through this lecture. And I can't help but think how similar this is to medical education. And this brilliant essay was written by a medical student, and it explores the pressures that exist within medical culture to harm those we should be serving. Medical students become less empathetic as they progress through their training. The process of medical education makes students acutely vulnerable to become complacent and susceptible to the pressures to cause harm. Physicians tortured people at Guantanamo Bay and committed so-called mercy killings during Hurricane Katrina. And many students were taught how to do pelvic exams on anesthetized women who could not consent. During World War II, 7% of doctors became members of the SS compared to less than 1% of the general population. And in her research, Cogliani discovered that most doctors who participated in the Holocaust were regular people who believed that they were doing an unpleasant but morally correct and necessary job. New doctors rapidly came to view the culture of the camps as an unchangeable fact. And I can't help but see how many veterinarians view what we do to animals in modern intensive feeding operations and in research laboratories as an unchangeable fact. In medicine, we mislead ourselves by using euphemisms, words like sacrifice and euthanize when we refer to killing. We learn detached professionalism to avoid burnout. We are socialized to obey hierarchies and respect our professors, residents, and attendings and trust their judgment and follow orders. We pride ourselves in our universities and depend on them for our income and career advancements, and we invested hundreds of thousands into our education. And these things make us reluctant to publicly expose or even acknowledge wrongdoing at these institutions because our reputation depends on their reputation. And concentration camp physicians adjusted to their new reality by means of extreme socialization, by watching their more experienced peers perform ramp selections and by commiserating with them afterwards. I see veterinarians doing this too, accepting the way things are instead of working to change harmful systems. And to cope, medical students become less empathetic and less ethical as they progress through medical school. Likewise, veterinary students have been shown to have stunted moral development. So the human medical profession is grappling with this and taking steps to mitigate this problem. And unfortunately, the American Veterinary Medical Association is not. And in fact, they are doing the opposite. And we'll go into how and why exactly that is. Another way to think about this is how someone becomes indoctrinated into a cult. Anyone going through veterinary school or medical school should closely study cults because you see a lot of similarities. And I won't go into this in depth. I'm going to record an addendum to this talk to discuss this more. So if you haven't seen the movie Fight Club, watch the movie Fight Club and then come back to my addendum talk and I'll discuss sort of the similarities with Fight Club and cults and how that relates to the veterinary profession. And this is a list that was created by Dr. Daniela Mastanek, who is a survivor of the Children of God cult, and then was the first woman in combat in the Army and realized that the Army, too, is also very culty. And there are culty organizations all around us, and I think it's important for all of us to be knowledgeable about how we can be manipulated and exploited by others. And these groups often start off with really good intentions and good ideas. And then as they get more power, they can wield their influence to bully others and protect others. And a lot of people think, well, could there possibly be a good cult? But there's really no such thing because groups of people conditioned to not think for themselves and groups that use social pressure, weaponizing people's needs for purpose and community, and then shunning them and ostracizing them and coercing others into attacking and otherizing people who are on the outside really does not ultimately benefit society. So one really important way to withstand the pressures to become susceptible to this cult mentality is to kill your heroes. This is why I love this quote. And it's a metaphor. It's meant metaphorically and non-violently. I don't actually mean to kill your heroes, but those who you admire and respect, you should be able to publicly critique and criticize. You shouldn't feel guilty for doing this and questioning them. And we sometimes feel like, we're led to believe, these powerful people who we respect, they're stressed, they're going through a lot, so much attention, they're doing such great work, I shouldn't challenge them now, their work is good enough. No, everybody should be challenged. And that is how we make our profession better and stronger. And if you were an activist, that's how we make our movement stronger, by challenging, criticizing, and questioning. We are a critical thinking movement. We are not a lockstep order following movement. And if you feel afraid to criticize your hero publicly, or worse, feel like there's nothing to criticize them about, you might be getting swept up in a very culty system. And be careful about labeling people heroes, victims, or perpetrators. We are often all three. And I love Hayao Miyazaki's movies. He made the movie Spirited Away and Kiki's Delivery Service and Howl's Moving Castle. And some say that his movies have no villains, and there are villains, though, I think, but they show a more kind and vulnerable side than we normally see. And so in his quote, he says, "You must see with eyes unclouded by hate, see the good in that which is evil, and the evil in that which is good. Pledge yourself to neither side, but vow instead to preserve the balance that exists between the two." And while I don't really understand preserving the balance of evil, I think, we often label things good or evil, when really we have to be careful and see that there are some bad things in the things that we are labeling as good, and there are some good things in the things that we are labeling as evil. And I think it comes back to this idea that of not judging others too harshly. If we lived in somebody else's body and we had their experiences, to say we would behave differently from them is to say that there's something inherently better about us or something inherently flawed about them. And to believe that would be perpetuating the concept of hierarchies. And that's the very thing that leads to all forms of injustice, that some people are better than others, some species are better than others or more worthy of our moral concern. And remember, many people who, we are concerned about right now, they're like those children who grew up in 4-H, who were socialized to objectify animals. Like, they started off being good, decent children, likely, but then they were led by a system to betray their conscience. So the mission of Our Honor is to empower veterinarians, students, and animal professionals to work for the best interests of others, no matter their species. And at Our Honor, we seek to raise awareness and highlight the systems that cause good people to betray their conscience and cause harm to others, and be a countervailing force against those systems. And in these environments, there's always a filtering process in order to achieve the ranks of the inner circle. So what is the antidote to these cult-like environments? These organizations create cultures where shame, imposter syndrome, and perfectionism are rampant, making us very guarded against criticism, especially from those we view as outsiders. And these harmful institutions and organizations create systems that foster institutional betrayal. So what is institutional betrayal? This is a fairly recent concept described by psychologist Jennifer Freed, referring to an institution's failure to respond to wrongdoings committed upon those who serve or are served by the institution. Retaliation against whistleblowers is a classic example. Women who report sexual harassment and sexual misconduct often face retaliation and professional consequences for voicing concerns. The remedy is for organizations to foster institutional courage, which in short is supporting whistleblowers, creating systems to protect them, apologizing for wrongdoing, and taking steps to prevent harm from taking place in the future. And all of us can be agents for fostering institutional courage, and I'll explain a bit more about that in the end. Another thing that perpetuates harmful systems in the veterinary profession, like all organizations, is a lack of diversity. The veterinary profession is homogenous, 93.3% white, and it has all the problems that come with a white supremacist profession. The field is incredibly unwelcoming to those of different backgrounds and beliefs, and people who aren't willing to assimilate to this culture usually self-select against entering the profession. So let's get into how the veterinary profession filters and socializes. So in the past, in order to train students, veterinary schools used to provide students with dogs, and they would perform multiple surgeries on them over the semester until finally ending the life of their patients. Bernard Rollin, who taught veterinary ethics at Colorado State University, discusses this in his book, and he spoke to other professors about why they were making students do these cruel labs. And these professors really believed that students needed to be tough, and they needed to kill a dog in order to be good doctors. And they should weed out students who shouldn't take it. And Rollin says, at one veterinary school, a senior class provided each student with a dog, and the student was required to do a whole semester of surgery on the animal. One student anesthetized the animal, beat on it randomly with a sledgehammer, and spent the semester repairing the damage. And he received an A. And now it's rarer for schools to perform multiple surgeries on one animal for practice, as it's viewed as unethical to repeatedly anesthetize an animal and cause them pain, wake them up, and then repeat it a few weeks later. They viewed it as more humane to have students practice surgery on one animal and end their life before they even got a chance to wake up. In the veterinary profession, we rationalize the killing of animals as not a big deal. They don't suffer at all. It's just sort of lights out. So what's the problem? And we haven't gotten beyond that mindset and questioned the ethics of ending someone's life and taking away their future experiences. But many veterinary students fought back by being conscientious objectors, and their stances ultimately led to a change of curriculum in their schools. And Dr. Kirsten Rosenberg was one of many students and professors who led UC Davis to end its terminal surgery program on dogs. UC Davis still has an elective course that kills pigs and calves, though. And Dr. Andrew Knight has published multiple academic articles showing students learn just as well, if not better, using humane alternatives. And Britton Hammett McCurry objected to University of Georgia's use of terminal surgeries in student education and established a non-terminal option, and now teaches surgery around the world with an international organization. But students still get bullied for being conscientious objectors at some schools. During her 2018 clinical year at Auburn University, Dr. Stephanie Bracel and her classmates were to practice surgery on a bull named Fred and then kill him. She had a panic attack thinking about having to do this to Fred and didn't want to participate. The faculty scolded her, threatened her with expulsion, and her peers mocked her, and she failed the class. But research has shown students are initially uneasy about these labs, but afterwards they justify it to themselves by saying it was a valuable learning opportunity, because to have someone tell them killing animals is wrong creates a lot of defensiveness. So I never had to kill animals in veterinary school to learn surgery, and now surgery is my favorite part of practice. I learned under the guidance of experienced surgeons on animals who needed surgery after practicing these techniques on models. And now I help teach students how to do surgery. And these are photos of me and our honor board member, Dr. Daniela Castillo in Mexico and Fiji and the Navajo Nation, teaching students on patients who benefited from our care. And many schools are trying to move away from terminal surgeries now. And this is the kind of And this kind of curriculum, which requires students to harm their patients, might actually impair students' moral development. This study found that normally expected increases in moral reasoning did not occur over the 4 years of veterinary medical education, suggesting that their medical and educational experiences somehow inhibited their moral reasoning ability rather than facilitating it. But animal agriculture publications like this spread misinformation that students are being denied adequate training because of animal rights activists. And some students and even instructors buy into this false narrative. I talked to CSU students who actually believed that they were missing out on valuable training. So, what strategies of social control are employed to perpetuate the status quo and prevent change? One we have seen is DARVO. DARVO stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse, Victim, and Offender. The institution or the leader will deny that they caused harm and attack those who criticize them, portraying the people like Dr. Fraisel as overly emotional or extremists, portraying the institution as the victim and those working for change as offenders causing harm. On an individual basis, we know this is how narcissists deal with criticism, and Dr. Jennifer Freed describes institutional DARVO, and we see this in responses of corporations and organizations accused of misconduct to avoid accountability. It's gaslighting. They deny the allegations, attack the whistleblower, and paint the whistleblower as the offender and they themselves as the victim. And whenever you see a person or an institution respond to criticism, look for these DARVO tactics. Another tactic is icing out, just denying alternative perspectives a platform. And it's concerning that both Dr. Andrew Knight and Dr. Nick Jukes both applied to present their research on humane alternatives in education at the annual conference of the American Veterinary Medical Association, and both were denied the opportunity to present. So, who is the AVMA? The AVMA is the largest veterinary organization in the United States. It has 100,000 members. It includes the AVMA Council on Education, which accredits DVM or equivalent educational programs. It assures minimum standards in veterinary medical education are met by all AVMA accredited colleges of veterinary medicine, and that students enrolled in those colleges receive an education which will prepare them for entry-level positions in the profession. It also lobbies and has a political action committee that lobbies for legislation. But who is really behind the AVMA? It's pharmaceutical companies and animal agriculture corporations. They sponsor many of their events, and the AVMA is structured to give veterinarians working in industry and animal agriculture a much bigger microphone than veterinarians working for animal protection. And despite the fact that the majority of AVMA members are companion animal veterinarians and don't work for animal agriculture or research, they are not able to have a voice on various committees as often as those who do work in animal agriculture and in industry. So what is the AVMA concerning themselves with recently? There has been a drastic increase in the number of women veterinarians. Previously, they weren't frequently accepted into the profession for fear that our education would be wasted when we decide to get married and have children. Until the Civil Rights Act of 1972 was passed, which hoped to prevent discrimination on the basis of sex. There are not enough food animal veterinarians to suit the industry's current needs. And there are two ways to solve this. You could either A, figure out how to increase the number of food animal veterinarians, or B, decrease the number of food animals who need veterinarians. I personally would go with B. as a shelter veterinarian, I feel like it is my job to make sure there is no need for shelter veterinarians in the future because all animals would have a home. But it seems the AVMA is going to go with Plan A. And here's a recent study about this. A 1996 study, it says, found that women were more likely than men to support the tenets of the animal protection movement, were more likely than men to favor increased restrictions on animal use, and were more concerned about the suffering of research animals. A study of veterinary students indicated that gender was the most significant predictor of attitudes towards animals and their use. Urbanization of the populace is an important factor also contributing to the shortage of veterinarians in food animal medicine. Future veterinarians who are not exposed to farm animals and agriculture as children are generally less likely to want to live in rural areas and practice food animal medicine as adults. Economic factors are also important in that rural areas may not provide as many job opportunities for spouses and partners of veterinarians. And I'm sure, women tend to have spouses who are employed and want to work. It's maybe they're thinking, maybe it's better to have the male veterinarian and maybe his wife is like a homemaker or something. That's a more likely scenario in a rural area. I don't know what they're going with here. So in these two-income households, it's kind of tougher for both spouses to have jobs in a rural area because of the lack of employment opportunities. Similarly, the rise in vegetarian and vegan movements, especially among young people, may dissuade students from pursuing careers in food animal medicine. So there's a lot of research into how we can produce more food animal veterinarians. And this recent study found that people were more likely to accept jobs in food animal medicine if they had come from a rural community, had prior food animal experience, and preferred to live in a rural community, and were male. A graduate's community of origin and preferred community are related to their selection of employment type. And they say here, if this information were examined during the admissions process in keeping with institutional goals, it could be used to identify applicants who have a strong likelihood of accepting food animal positions. Even more concerning here is another quote. Perhaps knowledge that gender has the potential to impact the profession broadly by shifting the number of graduates entering different employment sectors is an argument to gather this information during the application process for those institutions who wish to utilize it in strategic admissions decisions, which to me seems to violate the Civil Rights Act of 1972 and seems like we are advocating for things to go backward. This paper was just published by Jennifer Jaquette and Vivica Morris, and it is a deep dive into the industry funding of university researchers. And the meat industry has recognized now that their top sustainability executives are more valuable in academic positions than in the companies themselves. And these positions have helped maintain the industry's social license to operate. So what are the broader implications of this? Prioritizing corporate interests over equity and justice. In veterinary school, I learned the concept of One Health, that all species, plant, animal, environmental, are all interconnected. And 75% of emerging diseases are zoonotic and come from animals. So there's this battle within the veterinary profession. Corporate interests want to perpetuate this structure with man at the top, women underneath, and all species ranked below based on their ranking of moral concern to us. But in One Health, we should view all species like this circle. There is no hierarchy because if we cause injury or illness to one of these species, it affects all of us in the long term. And we have drastically changed the biomass distribution of Earth in recent times to the point where now 60% of the Earth's land animals are farmed animals and only 4% are wild animals. 70% of all birds on Earth are farmed poultry and only 30% of birds are free. And we have lost 83% of wild animals and 50% of plant species. So in recent times, we've also drastically increased the number of chickens and have drastically changed how we raise them, confining thousands in massive buildings to prioritize protein production and production efficiency. And we have drastically increased the number of pigs, and now 2/3 of mother pigs are confined in gestation crates like this for 114 days of their pregnancy. And you might think this is just related to our growing population, but no, we have drastically increased the amount of meat we consume per year from 50.6 pounds per person per year in 1960 to 264 pounds per person per year in the United States in 2020. So in the past 35 years, we have doubled the number of land animals raised for food in the United States. This also has to do with us switching from beef to eating more chickens. We have to raise more chickens, more individual chickens, in order to feed that growing population with that dietary shift. And that means big profits also for these corporations. But many other industries have an interest in growing the number of animals we slaughter as well, including corporations that grow feed crops and pharmaceutical companies that sell antibiotics and vaccines and other medications for slaughter-bound animals. If the numbers of animals raised for slaughter were to decrease, this would hurt their profits. And we are seeing an increase in the number of emerging infectious diseases as well. This spike in the 1980s and the 1990s, 1980s and 90s was due to AIDS, but the overall trend is still increasing. And around 80% of all antibiotics in the United States are used in animal agriculture, with 70% of these being medically important. And so we are seeing an increase in drug resistance diseases as well. I don't know where that is. So this headline is from 2022. But the highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak has gotten so much worse since even this headline, and now killing more than 81 million birds in the United States. And we know avian influenza has jumped to numerous mammals, and here it's infected minks and then spread through the farm, but it has also infected bears, seals, sea lions, and many other animals. And in Argentina, 96% of elephant seal pups born in the 2023 breeding season died of H5N1. The collected samples from sea lions, a furrow seal, and a tern that were found dead all tested positive for H5N1, and they shared the same mammalian adaptation mutations detected in the sea lions in Peru and Chile, and one human case in Chile. So while it's now adapted to mammals, it can affect birds and cause a multi-species outbreak. The viral sequence in the tern retained all its mammalian adaptations. And Dr. Marcela Uhart, a wildlife veterinarian within the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine's One Health Institute, said, as long as the virus continues to replicate in mammals, it may make it a concern for humans. But threat to humans aside, when you have a barn full of stressed, genetically similar animals in close contact with human beings, this is a breeding ground for viruses of pandemic potential. And now H5N1, it isn't 100% fatal to birds. In fact, I know a sanctuary that was infected with H5N1. They lost only 26 of 160 of their birds, and the state allowed them to save their animals. Ducks can harbor some strains and not show any signs and spread it to others. And some infected sanctuaries, like I said, were able to save their animals. But in large-scale production facilities, we have to grapple with the question of what is the most efficient way to kill thousands of birds in a facility to stop the spread of the disease. And the answer the industry came up with was sealing up buildings, pumping in heat, and waiting for the birds to die after many hours. And this horrifying method came to light nearly 4 years ago during the COVID-19 slaughterhouse bottleneck. Slaughterhouse workers were the most heavily impacted victims of COVID-19 early on in the pandemic. They and their family members got sick and were scared to go to work. Slaughter capacity was reduced by around 45%. And the pig industry operates in this just-in-time model. So as pigs reach slaughter weight, younger pigs are coming up behind them to take their spot. If there are no empty shackles on the slaughter lines for them, they quickly become overcrowded. So producers resorted to sealing up the buildings, pumping in heat, and waiting for the pigs to die. And thanks to whistleblower Lucas Walker, who worked for one company that did this, Iowa Select Farms, Matt Johnson was able to record the footage of this happening and make headlines exposing this horrifying practice. But some veterinarians thought that this was all just animal rights propaganda, until Iowa Select Farms communications director Jen Sorensen took to the media to calm the public and let them know that death by heat stroke was a veterinarian-approved method of mass killing. She said, veterinarians and production well-being professionals are overseeing the process to ensure accordance with the American Association of Swine Veterinarians and the American Veterinary Medical Association. So veterinarians realized this wasn't just animal rights propaganda. This method of killing was listed in the AVMA's newly published guidelines for the depopulation of animals. And we were horrified our profession was being used to legitimize this. Several of us co-founded Veterinarians Against Ventilation Shutdown, and we all wanted the AVMA to reclassify death by heat stroke as a not recommended form of mass killing. It's a pretty conservative ask, and now more than 2,000 veterinarians have signed on to our petition. We petitioned the House of Delegates in 2021, and the House of Delegates voted to push the question back to the panel on depopulation to consider. Unfortunately, they only meet every 10 years or so, or they only review their guidelines every 10 years or so. We heard they're going to meet in the interim. So we submitted another petition kind of asking, while the panel was deciding whether to reject this, or not, to amend the manual in the meantime, in the interim. But they, instead of doing that, they amended their House of Delegates manual to make sure that petitions like ours couldn't move forward. And I talked to several AVMA board members and House of Delegates members who were shocked that this actually happened and they don't remember voting on this. The AVMA's director of the Animal Welfare Division was concerned about the fact that heat stroke-based killing might leave the guidelines. And she's a member of the Scientific Advisory Council of the United Egg Producers and Dean Foods, Animal Welfare Science Council. And during an animal mortality management conference in North Carolina in June of 2022, she called on a friendly audience to help her find evidence to support leaving this method in the guidelines, saying, "One item I would like to place some emphasis on for this room, since I feel you are a little more friendly of an audience than I've had the opportunity to present for over the past couple of years, is we need data from you. And I know we've seen some presented here, even if it's not published. if it's a case report, if it's proprietary data or unpublished data, the panel needs it. Some of these methods are at risk of leaving the guidelines. I think you probably have an idea of what those methods might be. We need data to support them staying in the document. So this is a supposedly science-based panel, right? They rely on the science, but cherry picking data, calling for data to support this is not exactly the scientific method. So why is she defending this practice so much? Even if the AVMA reclassified it, it could still be used to kill animals, and the AVMA doesn't make the laws, but the USDA does look to the AVMA's guidelines to determine policy and indemnity payments. And if it was reclassified to be not recommended under current systems, in the case of killing with heat stroke industry, so then they would basically not be compensated under current systems. So in this case with killing animals via heat stroke, it was industry-funded research performed at an industry-funded public research university that was used to put this method in the guidelines. Those guidelines were then used to give public funds back to the very industry that created this policy. So how much money are we talking about? Taxpayers have spent more than $1 billion to bail out these large corporations for avian influenza outbreaks since 2022. Jennie-O Turkey Store got about $89 million. Tyson got more than $29 million. Jennie-O and Tyson are both huge multi-billion-dollar companies. Tyson brought in more than $13 billion. Despite avian influenza in 2023, while their CEO, Donnie King, brought in more than $13 million in his personal compensation. The majority of these companies failed to invest in putting plans in place to use less cruel methods of killing their birds. So now we're going back to 2020. Around this time, VSD was being used to kill pigs. This was an actual meme that went around veterinary Facebook groups. What led up to all this? I started posting things on my public Facebook page that were critical of animal agriculture. And my colleagues told me I really should shadow livestock veterinarians. So I knew what I was talking about. Okay, like I was in 4-H, I studied animal science at UC Davis prior to going to veterinary school. But sure, I'd love to shadow livestock veterinarian. But I was naive to the level of fear that the industry could foster against those they saw as a real threat. So I naively asked a shadow livestock veterinarian while simultaneously posting on my public Facebook page things critical of animal agriculture. Then my colleagues showed me this meme going around Facebook groups from the vigilant administrators of veterinary Facebook groups. And it says, "Beware, Crystal Heath is a self-proclaimed animal rights activist. She has an agenda that does not include anything positive for our profession. We recommend you block this person, Crystal Heath." And through a Freedom of Information Act request from the USDA Agriculture Marketing Service, we came across this email from the Animal Ag Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization whose board includes people from the animal agriculture corporations like Cargill and Smithfield, but also pharmaceutical companies. And they sent out this alert about me saying they believed my intentions were to gather information I could use against the industry, and she recommended this be sent to their veterinary contacts in California. So it was frightening, kind of how few people reached out to me to get my side of the story and just believed like this narrative about their colleague, blocked me and wouldn't talk to me. Members of the Animal Ag Alliance include the National Pork Board, which pays $10,000 a year to the Animal Ag Alliance. And so you have this government organization surveilling and discrediting professional private citizens critical of corporate practices that harm animals and threaten public health. Glenn Greenwald was fascinated by this story and covered it as the last article he wrote for The Intercept, and he had me on his show. And that's kind of how our honor started. So this is courageous Latina vegan veterinarian and our honor board member, Dr. Danielle Castillo, during the 2022 AVMA convention in Philadelphia. And she stood on a public sidewalk outside with her sign explaining what it means to be a vegan veterinarian and encouraging her colleagues to advocate against heat stroke-based killing. An older white male presenting veterinarian shoved her from behind and told her to get out of the way. Security followed us all around the convention and would line up at the back of each talk we attended, making us feel very unwelcome and probably making our colleagues feel very concerned about us as well. A few months later, several of us were banned from attending the AVMA's Humane Ending Symposium. Why? We didn't do anything wrong other than just writing things, very professional things on the internet, writing op-eds, letters to the editor about this topic. And AVMA leaders claimed to the media their refusal to let their paying members in good standing attend was so that producers could have a safe space to discuss mass killing without fear of reprisal, basically implying that we were somehow dangerous. But we were the ones facing reprisal, having been banned and silenced. So who sponsored this event? Well, it was Cargill, the largest agribusiness company in the world, as well as Charles Rivers Labs, pharmaceutical industry. They're both sponsors. Who did get to attend? Our FOIA research found non-veterinarian and VP of Industry Relations with the National Pork Producers Council, Jeff Pigote, was welcome to attend. So when you don't know the conflict, how do you tell who are actually the good guys and speaking truth to power and who are just the obnoxious aggressors? Look at the real power imbalance here. These are wealthy producers in positions of power, mass killing millions of animals. We are quiet lady veterinarians kindly asking for a seat at the table. I was also banned from attending the AVMA's last year, the legislative fly-in a few months later, and the AVMA sent me this obnoxious email saying, "We regret to inform you that we are canceling your registration to the AVMA legislative fly-in. The issues we will be talking about include legislation such as the Healthy Dog Importation Act, and participants in the fly-in will be focused on these particular issues rather than the issues you care so passionately about." And they didn't even sign it. And in fact, I do care about more than one issue, as I even did rescue a dog off the streets of Oaxaca, Mexico last year and brought her to the US. So I very much care about the Healthy Dog Importation Act. And Brené Brown summarizes what leads to such institutional betrayal. When the culture of any organization mandates that it is more important to protect the reputation of the system and those in power than it is to protect the basic human dignity of the individuals who serve that system or who are served by that system, you can be certain that shame is systemic, the money is driving ethics, and the accountability is all but dead. If you think back on any major scandal fueled by cover-ups, you'll see this same pattern. And the restitution and resolution of cover-ups almost always happen when one person steps outside their bunker and speaks their truth. But the one who speaks out must be prepared to deal with DARVO tactics and institutional betrayal. The resolution comes from institutional courage, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing apology and creating structures to prevent future retaliation of those who voice concerns, or else these betrayal wounds fester and harm continues. So what happens when an institution fails to acknowledge wrongdoing and betrays those who refuse to be intimidated? They regret it, and those betrayed make taking down the organization their new favorite hobby. We find allies and we publish stories in the media, many stories. And the international veterinary community also published several articles criticizing the AVMA, as did our own veterinarians. This is Dr. Danielle Castillo's commentary. And when an organization refuses to take accountability, you cannot engage with them or their flying monkeys as if they are good faith actors. Don't waste your time or energy. You have to go around them. Dr. Barry Kipperman, who teaches veterinary ethics at UC Davis, published this commentary in the British Veterinary Journal because the American Veterinary Medical Association journal would never publish such a thing. And this painstakingly detailed, peer-reviewed academic article explains what happened and what the AVMA must do to move forward. And all this effort for something that should not ever have been allowed in the first place. When there are many less brutal methods available, which illustrates how hard it is to stop harmful policies once they have been codified. And a common question we still get in veterinary spaces is, well, what are they supposed to do when avian influenza hits? It would be cruel to just let them all die of natural causes, and it would risk infecting others and causing greater suffering. So AWI made this table of available methods that lists the less barbaric methods used. But ultimately, the conversation needs to lead to how veterinarians must advocate for a scaling down of animal agriculture. So more op-eds were published, like this one in the SF Chronicle and the Washington Post, and many other outlets. This was written by the great Karen Davis, who passed away recently. And I remember many calls with her about VSD, and she was always a huge inspiration. And I helped with this piece that appeared in the Drake Journal of Agricultural Law. And last year at the AVMA convention, sustainability and the greening of veterinary practices was discussed. In our honor, submitted this executive summary to our delegates, highlighting the need for veterinarians to lead the transition towards more slaughter-free nutrient production. Dr. Martha Smith Blackmore is one AVMA delegate. She discussed the need to address intensive animal agriculture, and she shared our executive summary with her reference group. So soon there will be more of us in positions of leadership empowered to speak out. Susan Lieberman, Vice President of the Wildlife Conservation Society, a leader in the One Health movement, is quoted as saying, "The impediments to One Health in the past and moving forward are entrenched economic interests. The activities that cause emerging diseases are the same activities that give us palm oil in every food product, the metals in our phones, the fur trim on our winter jackets. They are the wildlife trade, the mining industry, industrial meat production, industrial agriculture, fossil fuel production, urban sprawl. All of these things that tear up animal habitats, wipe out species, and put humans, livestock, and wildlife in abundant contact. To take One Health to its logical conclusion would mean truly confronting these forces of commercial expansion and exploitation. It would mean ending factory farming and an end to the commercial wildlife trade." And this quote summarizes it. When you start with a necessary evil, and then over time, the necessity passes away, what's left? This is the older generation that used technology and innovation to prioritize the mechanization and industrialization and efficiency of modern slaughter-based protein production. Think of all the advancements in genetic selection, robotics, nutrition, vaccine, and medication development. But what if we aligned our technology with our conscience and considered the best interests of others? This is the current generation of veterinarians. They care about justice, climate change, and the environment, and we have to empower them to push back against harmful systems and redistribute our investments towards methods of food production and research that don't require large-scale destruction and exploitation. Beans, nuts, vegetables, and now things like precision fermentation could feed the entire planet using less arable land than we use now. We can get from this triangle to this circle, but we have to connect with our ancient caveman instincts to empathize with other animals. And thank you very much.